Hi, I'm Tammy Ryan. I'm a resident playwright at New Dramatists and a playwriting professor at Point Park University. And I'd like to introduce you to Trifles by Susan Glaspell. One of my favorite plays. I teach it at the beginning of every semester in my intro to playwriting class. The play opens on the scene of an abandoned farmhouse. 5 people arrive at the house to investigate the scene of a crime, including the county attorney, Mr. Henderson, the local sheriff, Mr. Peters, and the neighbor, Mr. Hale, who's discovered a murdered man, John Wright, strangled with a rope around his neck. The men are accompanied by 2 of their wives, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. Before this excerpt, Hale has just described how he found John Wright's dead body. He'd come to the house to ask Wright if he wanted to share a party telephone line, and instead he found his wife, Minnie Foster Wright, sitting in the rocking chair, calmly announcing that her husband was dead. The excerpt starts with the county attorney. You're convinced that there's nothing important here, nothing that would point to any motive? Sheriff, nothing here but kitchen things. County attorney, here's a nice mess. Mrs. Peters, oh, her fruit, it did freeze. She worried about that when it turned so cold. She said the fire'd go out and her jars would break. Sheriff, well, can you beat the women? Held for murder and worrying about her preserves. County attorney, I guess before we're through she may have something more serious than preserves to worry about. Hale, well, the women are used to worrying over trifles. County attorney, and yet for all their worries, what would we do without the ladies? Dirty towels. Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies? Mrs. Hale, there's a great deal of work to be done on a farm. County attorney, to be sure, and yet I know there are some Dixon County farmhouses which do not have such roller towels. Mrs. Hale, those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be. County attorney, loyal to your sex, I see. But you and Mrs. Wright were neighbors. I suppose you were friends, too. Mrs. Hale, I've not seen much of her of late years. I've not been in this house. It's more than a year. County attorney, and why was that? You didn't like her? Mrs. Hale, I liked her all well enough. Farmers' wives have their hands full, Mr. Henderson. And then, yes, it never seemed a very cheerful place. At the beginning of the play, when the men enter the farmhouse, they walk in with the assumption that they're entering a crime scene. And they're looking for a motive for murder, which everyone seems to agree was committed by Minnie Wright, but they don't have any proof. The women are there to bring Minnie some things home from her home to the jail where she's being held. They walk in with the assumption that they're entering a home, much like the farmhouses that they lived in. The difference in their expectations colors how each will read the clues that they're about to find. Right from the start, the men laugh at the women, dismissing the kitchen things. But the women, through their shared lived experience, knows what each of these kitchen trifles means, and they're able to fit the clues they find into a pattern. The dirty towel rolls. Later, they find bread is set outside of a basket. There's sloppy stitching in a quilt. The bird cage with its broken door, and a dead bird in a sewing basket wrapped in silk with its neck broken. These seemingly random clues fit together to tell a story, Minnie Foster Wright's story. Mrs. Hale begins to tell Mrs. Peters about Minnie's bright beginnings, singing in the choir, her difficult life homesteading on an isolated farm with distant and abusive husband she described as a raw wind. Minnie Foster had no children, no close friends, and no telephone, no way of connecting to other people in her community. The only joy, it seems, would be the singing canary, and it doesn't take a detective to figure out who rang that little bird's neck. The men in Trifles see nothing of significance in the kitchen things, and so they understand nothing about what happened, and it will be doubtful if they'll find a motive without the women's help. But they don't see the women with their worry over trifles as capable of helping them, and so that's a lost opportunity for them. But by the end of the play, not only have Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters solved the crime based on their reading of the evidence, they have bonded together to decide that Minnie Foster is justified in her actions, and their final action at the end of the play is to hide the evidence. Like Antigone in Sophocles' play, the women are responding to a higher moral imperative, which they see as above the laws of men. You could read the play as exploring gender conflicts, but I think its relevance today is broader. It raises the question of how do we as human beings perceive each other's truths? How do we take in, listen, and understand the stories that we hear, especially if we don't share a lived experience with the storyteller? Susan Glaspell has said, remember that the biggest stories are not written about wars or about politics or even about murder. The biggest stories are written about things that draw human beings together. Trifles feels like an especially relevant and necessary play for us in 2020.